Hey, how's it going? I'm Ron,
I'm Zach.
and we're back with another episode of Influences. We're starting to wind down here, aren't we?
We are.
Why don't you tell the folks at home what that means?
Well, we are at our 49th episode of Influences. And as per tradition, we have decided that our 50th episode will be something special. More details to come, probably within the 50th episode. However, after the 50th episode, we would like to start doing podcast, which we will get more on later. But we found that we've kind of exhausted many of the types of discussions that we are able to do with these types of episodes, and we are certainly very happy with them. But we feel that it is best to move on to something a little more versatile.
Exactly. So, we want to thank you guys for watching these episodes. And anyhow, this week we want to talk about a man who has definitely had an impact on us in one way or another. The late great director Stanley Kubrick. I've recently shown Zach a few of the key Kubrick films.
Which, in case you are not familiar, Stanley Kubrick is the director of many great movies such as The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut, Clockwork Orange, and many more. Movie adaptations of books and so on.
Indeed. And one of the things that I always loved about Stanley Kubrick was his method. He was a very meticulous director, and pretty much anyone who's ever worked with him sings his praises and says he's the greatest director that they've ever worked with. But they've also said he was one of the most exhaustively seeking directors, meaning that he would try everything before he said a scene was filmed. And so that also extended to his research into films. And when he went to make a film, well, I mean, even to go back a little further, before he decided what he was going to make a film about, he just went on the hunt. And it was one of the reasons why, compared to other directors who had been around the same amount of years, he only put out a few films. He didn't really have that many films that he put out.
I mean, considering how long he was making movies,
Yeah.
which was, I believe, from 1960, 50-something to
1999, 2000, when he passed away.
That's a pretty long time to be making movies, so it's,
He had roughly 15 films in all that time, and a lot of that was, as his wife once put it when she was interviewed about his process, he was looking for a story to fall in love with, something that he could put the next few years of his life into making. That really struck a chord with us. It's almost a reflexive thing to just write music and put it out, but to really invest yourself into something bigger than just putting out songs, whether it's concept albums or lyrics and storylines. We did that with this last album. It took a lot longer between our last two albums than our first two albums, because there was just so much more research and planning going into it, and being selective about the songs. There were a lot of songs that we wrote that didn't make the cut, and a lot of that was influenced by Stanley Kubrick's process. So the chunk of movies that he put out were his last few movies, starting with Doctor Strangelove. And Doctor Strangelove began a series of what you would call the golden age of Stanley Kubrick. And it's interesting to talk to different people about the Stanley Kubrick movies, because there really isn't a consensus on what the best Kubrick film is. A lot of people have their own personal favorite ones. I've talked to, like for instance, Brian, our guitar player. He loves Doctor Strangelove. That's his favorite Stanley Kubrick film. After Doctor Strangelove came A Clockwork Orange. And
that is my favorite. I think it's the most weird out of all of them. I mean, which is kind of a bold statement, but I enjoy the really kind of otherworldliness of it. Even though it is based off a book, I think that the way it was adapted into a movie was incredible. So I highly recommend it. It's definitely not an easy movie, I suppose, but it is very interesting.
Yeah, Clockwork Orange was the first Stanley Kubrick movie that I ever saw. Probably the one I've seen the most times through. And that's another interesting thing about Stanley Kubrick films. As you go through, go through them, and I know that I'm not alone in this experience. A lot of people say this.
The more you watch them, the more rewarding they become.
Yeah, at first there were quite a few Stanley Kubrick films I didn't like the first time I saw them, but somehow through repeated viewings, they creep into your consciousness. You see something new, and you catch a different vibe, and it's pretty remarkable that he was able to do that. But I think it also worked against him, where a lot of people just didn't have the patience for that, or the belief that there would be rewards with repeated viewings. After Clockwork Orange, he put out a movie called Barry Lyndon, and to be honest with you, neither of us have seen that one. That's the one that remains like, we'll get to it at some point, but it doesn't seem very interesting, but I'm sure we'll find something to like about it once we do. But the one after that was The Shining, starring Jack Nicholson. And that is I always thought that was quite an interesting choice for him to make a movie out of. Kubrick never struck me as the guy that would make a movie out of a blockbuster novel, horror novel. And indeed there was a bit of back and forth between Stephen King, the writer of the novel, and Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick basically bought the rights to make the film and said, I'm going to make this the way I want it. I'm going to change the story. And Stephen King reportedly hated the finished product, still hates it to this day. Hated it so much that he remade the movie in the 90s. And depending on your point of view, you might think that you might like it or not. I think Stephen King's version of the movie was just not good, and Stanley Kubrick is Stanley Kubrick. He definitely made it a Kubrick film. I'm sure that's one of the ones that you're most familiar with. You know, we did skip over 2001, Space Odyssey.
Which I believe was in the early 60s.
68. That was the one that came out before Clockwork Orange, came out between Doctor Strangelove and Clockwork Orange. The interesting thing about 2001 is it shows some very convincing films that Kubrick made of Earth from outer space before we had been to outer space to really see what Earth looked like from afar, and you got it pretty close. It's a pretty interesting film. It's a difficult film to figure out what the hell's going on in it, like a few of his other films. That's one of the other criticisms.
But I do think there's a lot of deep, sublime messages that are very valuable within all the movies.
Indeed.
There's a couple more movies that were made, Full Metal Jacket being one of them that's quite popular. Honestly didn't really do it for me, being that it's a war film. It's fairly plain and simple. It's great for what it is, but I feel, especially when comparing it to all the other Stanley Kubrick films, it doesn't stand up in a outstanding, pushing the boundaries artistic sort of way. Definitely a great film. Probably one of the best war films that I've seen, but
Difficult to watch. The first half is in the boot camp, for those of you that haven't seen it, and the staff sergeant is iconic. He's just legendary, and it really portrays the rigors of boot camp in a way that you can just very much feel while you're watching it. I feel the same way. The movie is difficult for me to get through just because it's a war film, and it's not really a genre that I personally go out of my way to see. But there is a certain connection through all the different subjects that Kubrick has tackled. There's a certain connecting thread throughout all the films, and it's the flaws of humanity, how human beings sabotage themselves, and it's really interesting to see that portrayed in so many different contexts. Now, after Full Metal Jacket, it was another 12 years, I believe, till Kubrick put out his final film, which was Eyes Wide Shut, starring Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who were married at the time that the film was made. This film has got some pretty graphic sexual themes and such, but the more important aspect of the film is the dynamic that happens between men and women. And without giving too much of the film away, there's definitely the masks that we wear for one another. Kubrick, this film really got slammed. A lot of people just thought it was garbage, and when I first saw it at the theater, I kind of stormed out of the theaters. Oh, this is awful. And somehow I saw it again, and I liked it a little bit more, and I saw it again, and I liked it quite a bit more, and now it's one of my favorite Kubrick films. But I can't really pick a favorite, but that's definitely one of them. I just love the soundtrack to it. It's a very minimalist, just a piano soundtrack that just is so haunting and effective in the scenes. And there's an allusion to the Illuminati, or some kind of secret society in the film, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that Kubrick was trying to kind of expose a little bit. Who knows? But it's interesting stuff to speculate about, and I guess that's the cool thing about his films, is they get you talking about, what was he getting at there, or hey, did you see that little thing there? That was a little symbol, or little clues that he leaves in his films. But unfortunately, we'll never know about a lot of that stuff because he passed away very shortly after making Eyes Wide Shut, and so he left behind only a handful of films.
Anyways, in short, the thing we really admire about Stanley Kubrick is how meticulous he was with all of his work, and how no expense was spared and every little detail was mapped out. And you can almost be assured that whenever you watch a Stanley Kubrick film, every little bit of it was planned to the last millimeter. It's all very impressive, and we definitely aspire to take a part of that and implement it into our own art.
Yeah, and a really quick last note here, there's 2 documentaries that really give a nice glimpse into his life and his process. And one is called Stanley Kubrick, A Life in Pictures. It's narrated by Tom Cruise, and it interviews everyone who was close to him and everyone who worked with him, and it goes through all of his humble beginnings and all of his pictures, and it's just a fantastic documentary. And then there's another one called Stanley Kubrick's Boxes, and that one was really revelatory to see. Basically, he had a whole warehouse full of boxes, and after he passed away, his family and friends started going through these boxes, and they discovered that it was meticulously organized research, files on his movies. So for instance, if he had one scene in a movie that was in front of a storefront, he had a box full of all these different locations that he went and took pictures of storefronts. And it was everything in every one of his movies, the clothes, the set designs, the props, and he had everything organized. And to see that kind of meticulous organization with his research, you begin to understand why it took him so long to make a film, and why every single second of what was on that movie, what was in that film, on every scene, was something that he really labored over. And that's an inspiring thing to put, to feel like, you know, all of his actors would say, when we left, we never felt like, oh, if I just would have had one more take. They explored, and sometimes it took a ridiculous amount of time. It took weeks to get one scene, but when they nailed it, they knew they nailed it, and they knew that they had tried everything. And that is an inspiring thing to look at as a band and say, hey, let's go down these roads that we're thinking about here, and let's explore, let's see what we can do with this stuff, and we'll know that we really searched. We left no stone unturned to come up with the final thing, and I'm sure we'll never do that on the level of Stanley Kubrick, but it was inspiring to have that to look to and say, you know what, let's try a few more things. And so anyhow, hats off to Stanley Kubrick, legendary filmmaker, and all of his greatness. And we want to thank you for watching again. If you got any comments you want to add to this, feel free, hit them below. Love to have you subscribe. We're going to be getting more into our YouTube channel here, adding a lot more content to it for you guys and making it a little bit more exciting. And that's one of the reasons why we want to kind of encapsulate this 50 episodes of influences and then move on to some more different stuff, more comprehensive and more interesting, we hope. So thanks so much, and as always, keep on rocking.